Arnold Steinberg is a political strategist and analyst who wrote 2 classic graduate textbooks on politics and media, and he's the veteran of hundreds of national, state, and local political campaigns, including that of U.S. Senator James L. Buckley of New York. Over several decades, he has been widely published in magazines, newspapers, and online, and he has been interviewed for many publications and has been a frequent guest on television and radio programs. He started in broadcasting as a student panelist at Fred Friendly's Public Broadcasting Laboratory, the precursor for national public television. His story and his life is the subject of a new political memoir. It's called Whiplash, From JFK to Donald Trump, A Political Odyssey, which is available for purchase in the museum store. In this engaging and provocative political memoir, Mr. Steinberg provides an insider's look into the often widely misunderstood history and nature of political conservatism in American politics. Ever since its inception in the 1950s, through the Goldwater years, the Reagan Revolution, and now to the era of Donald Trump. It's no reason why the conservative radio talk show host, Dennis Prager, he says, "I can honestly say that whenever I see something by Steinberg, I immediately read it. That's how remarkably insightful he is. This book is important." Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Arnold Steinberg.
Thank you very much. You know, the last time that I was here was just over 2 years ago when Ambassador Michael Orner, former ambassador from Israel, was speaking, and I was here with Congressman Ed Royce, who represents the district, and a friend of mine for over 4 decades. And it's really kind of timely because it was, I think it was July of 2015. Anecdotally, you all get a kick out of this, but the idea was he had rushed publication of the book hoping to defeat the Iran deal. And I met with him privately at some length upstairs with Congressman Royce, who heads the Foreign Affairs Committee. And we talked about the fact that the congressional recess was the best time to mobilize reaction against this and try to prevent this deal. And I remember at the time that Donald Trump had, a few months earlier, commenced running for office and was basically using up all the oxygen in the American political landscape. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if he could seize upon this issue? Because no matter what he did every morning and every afternoon and evening, it was covered live on CNN, mainstream media, Fox News. So I called a friend of mine who has known Donald Trump for more than 3 decades, and I said, you know, this is a no-lose issue for him. If he somehow blocks the treaty, it's going to be a tremendous coup, and if he doesn't, he's going to score a lot of brownie points for having tried, and it's going to help establish his credentials on foreign policy. I said, could I prepare a briefing for him? He said, well, okay. He said, but, you know, he's different than the people you usually deal with. You have to be very, very concise. So, you know, there's that old adage about, you know, I would have written a shorter speech, but it would have taken me more time. And so I struggled and kept condensing. I finally, you know, I lowered the type size, I stretched the margins, and I put it down to 1 page. And I thought, so I never heard back from my friend. About 2 weeks later, I called and I said, you know, I never heard back. This is an issue is very, very important to me. And he said, you know, it was too long. So I want to tell you that I'm struck in taking the tour and seeing the new things here, how awesome it was. But I saw the Nixon approach to China, and I remember it contemporaneously at the time, and I'll talk about it a bit later. But you know, when I thought about the Iran situation, what President Obama had in mind was a strategic vision of an opening to Iran. And what President Nixon had in mind was a strategic opening to China. The problem was that President Nixon had what I judged to be a pro-American strategy, and what President Obama had, I viewed to be a pro-Iranian strategy. There simply was, you could make a case for an opening to China, which I'll discuss in a moment. There was no case to be made for establishing Iranian influence and hegemony in the Middle East. There was a reverse case to try to discredit the government there. Now, I was very naive at the time. I won't say naive, but wasn't well informed. I remember as a conservative, I was one of those conservatives who was very upset at what President Nixon did at the time. And I had a friend of mine who I came to know, who was much older than I, who had been a dissident in the Soviet Union. And he was Jewish, and when Israeli independence occurred, he and some friends decided to leave the Soviet Union. And in those days, trying to leave was punishable by death there, because it was a sign of disloyalty to the regime. This is when Stalin was in power. He was sentenced to serve in Patma prison camp in Siberia, and he served from 1950 to 1955 until the Stalinist amnesty. His name was Roman Brockman, and his two colleagues became the catalyst for what became known as the Soviet Jewry movement. And Roman took me aside, he said, he said in his Russian accent, the problem with you Americans is you don't think like a Russian. And he said, Nixon is a brilliant man. What he is doing will someday lead to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. He said, they hate the Chinese in the Soviet Union. You've never been there, and I had not been there. Well, in 1979, I was there. I was on a foreign delegation, and just before that, we had done something that some more approach around with the Chinese, and they moved us from the hotel we were supposed to be at to an awful hotel with roaches. And so I said to the person who was the head of our delegation, I said, what's going on here? And they said, well, they're showing their protest. And I began to talk. I found out that they did hate the communist Chinese there. They were communists. And so I believe that what Nixon did set in motion the fall of the Soviet Union. There were other factors, of course, but because he sensed this. With Obama he basically had a vision that was basically, he started the administration, and he said this before, that we had to accept Iran as a fact of life there. Well, Communist China we really did have to accept. Iran we didn't. And Iran was not going to be an ally with us against other bad guys. Communist China was going to help make the Soviets anxious and nervous and upset, and therefore were going to help us. And so what Nixon did couldn't be undone, and what Obama did is being undone. Because, I felt as a hardliner that agreement, or he said not a treaty with Iran, should have been ratified by the United States Senate, which would have required 2/3, and he couldn't have gotten those 2/3. Senator Corker and others said, well, let's go and just make this requiring a simple majority because it's an agreement there. I thought that was wrong, but the one good thing of it is when you have an agreement, you can undo it, and the next president can undo it. And that's why the current president has the power to undo it and is on his way to decertifying that. And it's much like what you see right now with the executive orders. President Obama did so much in executive orders that some of us objected to, but executive orders can be undone by executive orders there. So that's the good side of it. Now, the paradox for those of us who are conservatives is we don't really believe in an overreaching executive power. We don't want a strong president except in times of war and so on there. So we paradoxically are in the position of wanting a strong executive to undo the prior strong executive there, and that's where we're at there. So if you look, for example, what happened with Jerusalem there, when President Trump said he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, he was, in fact, merely following more than 2 decades of strong congressional votes in the Senate and the House. Now, the mainstream media are saying this is a reversal of American policy when it's really an affirmation of American policy. But what he has done can't be undone. Can you imagine a future American president coming up and saying, I now no longer recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the United States? And you may recall a U.S. Supreme Court decision where Americans that had children born in Jerusalem, the passports would not say Jerusalem, Israel. And they went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court, for its decision, said, we're going to side against the kids, against the parents, and say it's just going to say Jerusalem there, because we defer to the executive power of the presidency, and so far the president continues to postpone recognition of Jerusalem. So now they can't do that anymore. So I wanted to just begin my talk by going, because I've just touched upon a lot of the factors that I think are important. We are at the Nixon Library, and the start of my book, I talk about the fact that I was 12 years old and I was drawn to John F. Kennedy, and in that course of that sort of romanticism of this young, energetic fellow, and as compared to Dwight Eisenhower, balding, older guy. And, you know, when you're 12 years old, anybody over 25 seems old, and somebody who doesn't have any hair seems especially old. And so I, you know, fell for that fallacy that we had this older guy playing golf all the time, and this younger, virile guy with this attractive wife, and had all the, he used to say vigor, meaning vigor, V-I-G-O-R, the Massachusetts accent. And I was only disabused of that after the Bay of Pigs, which I found very disillusioning. And a lot of people I knew were in the same situation. A much older friend of mine, also of about 4 decades, Bruce Hershenson, was also a JFK guy. And I since ran into many people who had the same story, who were about 10 or 15 years older than I, or about the same age there, and the Bay of Pigs began that disillusioning process. Being here at the Nixon Library, at the same time, I was very anti-Nixon, and I fell for that, all the things about how awful he was and all the rest. And I remember as a young boy watching those television debates, and it was only years later that when I read Teddy White's book, The Making of the President, 1960, and the history, that I realized that in so many ways that campaign was instructive for the future of American politics. For example, as many of you may know, those who listened to the debates on radio said Richard Nixon won, and those who watched on television said John F. Kennedy won. So it was the first strikingly demonstration of the impact of visuals on American politics there, and how it would color your impression there. And I remember, you know, that the campaign was far more negative against Nixon than the campaign was negative against John F. Kennedy, with one exception, Kennedy's Catholicism. And I remember, you know, thinking about all this during the Romney campaigns. I had done done many surveys in my life, and one of them was done for some consultants representing the Unification Church, the Moonies, Reverend Moon, and they were very involved in funding conservative politics. And so in doing the survey, they wanted to know how people felt about their religion. So we talked about other religions in it. And I have to tell you, as somebody who is Jewish, I was struck by the data that the level of prejudice or bias against Mormons was 6 or 7 or 8 times the level of prejudice or bias against Jews. And it was a revelation, 1980s, and that struck with me. And so when I watched the Romney campaign, I could see how that, and as some of you may know, surveys showed that there were more people who felt his Mormonism was a deal breaker than who felt that Obama's being an African American was a deal breaker there. Now, there were people who would say, I won't vote for Romney just because he's a Mormon, as opposed to someone who would not vote for Obama because he's an African American there. And so in that 1960 campaign, when I was 12 years old, I remembered vaguely, but then when I read history, how John F. Kennedy confronted the issue, went to ministers in Houston and gave a very famous speech there. And it was because Kennedy did what was politically atypical. Usually in politics, if you have a negative, you say, let's not confront it, let's put it aside, it's going to go away. Especially if you have something dealing with prejudice or bias there, you don't want to legitimize it. But sometimes, rarely, you have to confront it. Romney never did, and JFK did. So when you go back there, and so when I looked at the Nixon campaign and looking back, you know, those of you who either are old enough or read history remember that his makeup job was so bad there that alone was dispositive. It was definitive there. And so when people tell you they care about issues, you know, it's a perfect example of how perception affects reality. And in politics, as we know, perception is reality. And I remember a few years later, that 1960, and you see here in the exhibit there about the Nixon, you know, famous news conference, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore. And that was the first lesson to me about humility in politics there, that you really don't know what the future holds, and how often those who are experts don't know. I've, in my life, been involved with a lot of people who are experts, including experts in the Soviet Union, and I don't know a single one who thought the Soviet Union was going to fall in their lifetime or my lifetime, and including myself. And that was a perfect example. Now, maybe Nixon himself believed that emotionally at the time there, and he probably did, but you can't really count anybody out. And he showed and what his successor did years later, that he then campaigns a good sport for Barry Goldwater in 1964, knowing Goldwater would lose because he wanted to have that positive image of being a good sport there. And then in 1966, he was the first person to perfect this idea that has now been copied of campaigning for candidates for senator and House to earn their support for a subsequent one for president. And later on, you've seen many people who would go out and raise money to basically collect IOUs later on when they ran for president of the United States. I wanted to share a few anecdotes with you. When I was in Young Americans for Freedom, I kept trying to contact one person who I couldn't get any phone calls returned. We were trying to raise money. We didn't pay ourselves any salary. We were college students at UCLA. And this man was C.C. Mosley. And he was a very rich guy, and I couldn't get calls returned. And one day I was on a television show, and the next day I got a call at our Young Americans Freedom office, and they said, it's C.C. Mosley on the line. And I learned at that point that, you never know what happens in politics and the student movement. Things just happen. A fellow I could never reach there who I could never get past the secretary, saw me on television. I bring up the story because as I began talking to Mr. Mosley, he was a much older man than I learned he came out of World War I penniless and was such a good talker that he talked some people into lending him money and started Western Airlines. And he was Richard Nixon's first financial backer there. And he told me about the 1944 and 1946 races. When I look to these periods of time with Richard Nixon, I look at 1968, and one of the themes of my book is that seemingly random events have effects that we cannot foretell. We simply don't know where they will lead. 1965, my high school prom from Fairfax High was the Ambassador Hotel. Almost to the day, 3 years later, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated at the Ambassador Hotel. Back in New York State, Nelson Rockefeller was still harboring presidential ambitions. He'd wanted to run in 1960, he lost out. In 1964, he lost out. Think about why he lost out, though, ladies and gentlemen. He lost out because he got divorced. Now, we're talking about no more than a half century ago, a candidate for president was essentially disqualified by the electorate because he got divorced. Compare that to today, he probably would get extra votes if he got divorced. So, Nelson Rockefeller went to the congressional delegation in New York, and he decided to go because the delegation was more conservative than he was. He said, you pick somebody. So they went upstate Jamestown, New York, and picked Charlie Goodell, who had a conservative voting record. Now, what they didn't know is that Charlie Goodell had a liberal mistress. And so upon being elected to the Senate, he then became liberal, and he became Nixon's main opponent in the U.S. Senate against Vietnamization there. There was George McGovern on the Democratic side and Charlie Goodell. By the way, Charlie's son is Roger Goodell, the fellow who gets $40 million a year at the National Football League. And President Trump says, like father, like son, that the Senator Goodell was at a thorn in the Nixon side, and Roger Goodell was a thorn in my side, he said at a White House reception. In any case, so he appoints Goodell, and Goodell gets in. Now, I had been involved with William F. Buckley Jr. in many things. I met his brother, and so they talked about could his brother win for the U.S. Senate, and this comes back to where we are here today in the Nixon Library. Is President Nixon decided he couldn't stomach Charlie Goodell in the Senate. And so he sent out word to us that the idea that a Republican president would not back a Republican nominee for U.S. Senate was anathema. And so there were three candidates running in New York, Ottinger on the Democratic side, Buckley on the Conservative Party side, and then you had Charlie Goodell, Republican. And so 1/3 of our campaign budget was financed by one man who was a confidant and friend of President Nixon there. In those days, you didn't have campaign finance laws or disclosure laws, and I remember in those days our campaign was $1.7 million. It was a short campaign because in New York State, you didn't have the process you have here by nomination. So the Conservative Party would meet, their delegates would meet and nominate somebody, not a primary process. So the campaign was just a few months long. And I will tell you that Mr. Bouquet, he was a very rich man, had given a couple of $100,000, and about 10 days before the campaign, we were kind of short. And I was young and working very late. It was about 11:30 at night. And being in New York, you had a security guard. And the guard called up and said, there's a man here in a tuxedo, and he says he contributes to the campaign and so on. I thought, well, I'll go down. It was Mr. Bouquet. And he said, well, how are things going? I said, well, fine. He said, well, do you have enough money? And I had just been at this meeting earlier where we mapped out, and what would be the perfect amount if money came from heaven, And we said, well, if we could do everything, it would be $300,000. So he said, well, and I said, well, I said, we could use $300,000. I wasn't trying to hustle him or raise money. I wasn't sophisticated enough or old enough to even think in those terms. I was just saying that. And so the next day, his lawyer called and he said, well, Mr. O'Kay's leaving for Ireland, and he needs 100 names of committees for $3,000 each to avoid the gift tax. And so I took an intern, and they had to think up 100 different committee names, get his money, fly it to Washington, D.C. on an Eastern shuttle, deposit, and come back there. And in those days, and so Mr. Mulcahy doesn't want his name attached. Now, it wasn't because he was sinister or a crook or wanted something in return. He just valued his privacy there. He just didn't want to be solicited by a lot of people there. So his total came to, I think, $550,000 out of our campaign, but to $1.65 million. And so President Nixon implicitly, secretly, was backing Buckley, who eventually won in that race in 1970. And it's really a terribly interesting and dramatic story. I was in Young Americans for Freedom, and our national chairman a couple years before I became active was Tom Houston of the infamous Houston plan, which you've read about. And Tom is probably about 7 or 8 years my senior, and he's a person of slight build. He was in Army intelligence, and he established a friendship with Nixon, worked in the White House. And Tom was and is a very intelligent man, but he could be on the arrogant side. And so one of the first things he decided to do was to come up with an intelligence plan, because he felt that we were under great threat. And some of you, when you read all the awful things that are happening today in the student movement on campuses, may not realize back then that the 1960s were an era of great violence on campus, of many bombings and civil riots and so on. And so there was an era where they honestly felt there was a coordinated conspiracy. And Tom now writes that he was wrong, that there was no conspiracy. There were threats and there were problems, but there was no kind of central command. So Tom, at the age of 28, went to see J. Edgar Hoover and explained to Mr. Hoover, probably about 45 years his senior, that he, Tom, at the age of 28, was in charge. So Hoover threw him out of the office, called up the president and said, don't you ever send this guy here again. But the historical record has basically talked over and over again about a Houston plan, an intelligence plan to discredit President Nixon. It never really happened, and the author of the plan himself disavowed it shortly thereafter as really a result of miscalculation and youthful impetuosity. When you look back at the Nixon administration from a standpoint of American conservatism, it's very interesting, because in 1972, the revolt in the conservative movement was predicated upon several issues. One was the China issue, which drove it emotionally, and John Ashbrook's primary challenge to Richard Nixon. And I wasn't as excited about that as I was against Richard Nixon's imposition of wage and price controls, which, from being a libertarian and being associated with Milton Friedman and others, that really appalled me. And looking back, that's what most appalled me. Now, there were other problems. Richard Nixon's administration was one that started affirmative action. And as I tell my liberal friends who have gone headlong to this whole era of racial and gender preferences there, where we have one defined group after another that needs some special dispensation there, is that Nixon did it for the wrong reasons. He was having problems with unions, and he developed what's called the Philadelphia Plan, because unions were among the most discriminatory racially in American society. And so Nixon saw this as a way to embellish his civil rights credentials, which were excellent during the 1950s, absolutely excellent, but at the same time to gut some of the unions that were opposing him. And that was the genesis of affirmative action, and we were paying the price today for this absurd policy. Now, I tell you another anecdote is how many of you have from New York? Anybody here? Well, there's in Queens, there was an area that was Rego Park, Forest Hills. And so under the Nixon administration, there were a bunch of liberals within it. And they decided that they wanted to take public housing and establish a large building in this very middle-class area that was indeed already racially integrated and integrated ethnically. Many of the people who lived there were refugees from public housing. That is, they had done a little bit better in life, and they'd come to this area there. So we looked it over, and we decided this was a ridiculous situation. It was kind of social experimentation. And every time we studied it, came up with an objection, the bureaucrats at the Housing and Urban Development Department would surmount it. Like we'd say, well, it's near LaGuardia Airport, and they can't open the windows, there'll be too much noise. So they put an air conditioning in the plans. Went on, and then we'd have geology reports. It was going to sink, and they'd come up with some new method. It went on, and the per unit cost was going to be astronomical. In 1971, it was going to be like $124,000 a unit, and so finally, my boss, Senator Buckley, who was a totally mild-mannered, nice, easygoing guy, you really had to get him going. And he finally just couldn't take it anymore. He felt it was so stupid and so off and such a waste of taxpayer money that he went to see the president. He came back, and I said, how did it go, Jim? Because we said, you've got to get this guy fired, Bill Green, who's the regional administrator, a very liberal Republican of HUD. So I said, what happened? And he said, well, and he went through the meeting and so on. He said, and then I said, Mr. President, I explained all this to you and so on. I'm here. I would never say this, but I feel I have to ask you to have William Green dismissed. And President Nixon said, what? And he said, he repeated again, I said, your regional administrator, this is the source of the problem. My office has gone over this, and we can't get this project canceled. They're thwarting it, and it's against my constituents and so on. And I'm here to ask you, I feel I had to come here. I would normally never do this, but I have to ask you, can you, would it be possible for you to ensure that Bill Green is fired? And Nixon said, what did you say? And he said it one more time. And Nixon said, that's funny. I fired him 3 times. And, this was an illustration of just, how powerful the bureaucracy is there, that this was a president he already determined the past what a screw-up this guy was there, and somehow he gave the order, and the guy was still there. And I often tell that anecdote when people talk about making change in government. I do want to talk a little bit about the 1973 war, in Israel. I really have felt that this is an area where Nixon has really been mischaracterized and defamed with respect to Jews. I grew up in the Fairfax area. Murray Chotiner was Nixon's original campaign manager, happened to be Jewish. But the fact is that, almost every senior person in government at that time was opposed to the airlift in 1973 when Golda Meir called Nixon in the middle of the night at the height of Watergate. And often for good reasons. The Pentagon just said, we can't spare those parts. Except for one nation, all our European allies refused air to land and refuel. And in those days, aerial refueling was even more of a challenge than it is now, where it's been a little bit routine. And Nixon, basically going against all the advice, ordered this emergency airlift. And when you go back and you look at the record of FDR, and you look at all the things he said about Jews, which are now coming to come out, and the great exaggeration that's been given to Nixon's comments, it's terribly unfair. There's somebody who was spoken here at the library who's a friend of mine, Jeff Donfeld, and I remember Jeff telling me, and again, he's probably about 5 or 6 years my senior, he was an intern at Nixon's law firm, a Stanford law student at Nixon Rudge, and then Nixon took him on to the White House. And Jeff said to me, I don't get all this anti-Semitic stuff about Nixon. And I said, well, why, Jeff? And Jeff said, well, I really got along with Nixon at the law firm, and so on. And he took me on. He said, but he kept trying to get me to date Tricia, and which I did. And then he said, well, will you take Tricia to the debutante ball? And and I said, well, yeah, that would be great. Nixon said, well, you'll need a tuxedo, and Jeff didn't really have any money, so I don't have a tuxedo. I guess I can rent one. Nixon said, no, come to my closet. You're about my size, and so on. And Jeff was telling me this story because of the fact that Jeff is Jewish, and he's very Jewish, and so on. And of course, you know, nobody who was anti-Semitic would have done what Richard Nixon did there. And the same thing I know working for Senator Buckley at the time, contemporaneously, we were dealing with redoing Voice of America and Radio Liberty programming because we recognized strategically that it wasn't Jews that were the issue in the Soviet Union, it was dissent. It was going against the government. And if somehow you could get mobilization to the Jewish dissent, you would legitimize other dissent. And that's why the Soviet Union kept news reporting down, because if you were somebody who was a dissenter in Kiev or St. Petersburg, then called Leningrad there, you desperately needed the encouragement to know that there was somebody else who was demonstrating or possibly going to jail for their beliefs there. And so Radio Liberty and the Voice of America were absolutely key. And so when I would debrief people who had been dissenters there with the translators, and I would say, well, what can we do? You know, one of the things they said to me, which will sound terribly obvious to all of you here, is that there are a whole bunch of time zones in the former Soviet Union. They said, you know, we have families, we work, and so the rest, but we need to know that there are other people resisting. We can't stay around listening all day to the radio. We can't do that. Could you go and talk to them and find out if there could be a particular time each day where we would know they're reporting other dissenters and resistors to the Soviet Union? So that was a change we made that sounds terribly easy, but it's the kind of thing that we felt very comfortable working on with the Nixon administration and the head of the U.S. Information Agency, Frank Shakespeare then, and the head of the Motion Picture Division was Bruce Hershenson, who some of you know and may have heard here before, who's a dear friend of mine. And many of you may not realize that Bruce got his start during the Kennedy administration with John F. Kennedy there, and Bruce is the one who did the film on Jackie Kennedy's trip to India and John F. Kennedy's trip to the Berlin Wall, and eventually did the film on his death. I'm trying to think of some other things we might touch upon before going to questions and answers. I guess one of them would be, in terms of the ethics of presidents, you know, when you go through the museum here and you look at what happened during Watergate as compared to prior presidents and current presidents, it becomes very difficult to explain and rationalize the impeachment process there. When you look at Watergate, I remember a good friend of mine, Doug Caddy, was the original attorney for the 5 Watergate burglars called in the middle of the night, and to this day he still won't give me the complete story. And then another person that I knew who was a Democrat was, it turns out by various news reports, is alleged to have been running a prostitution ring out of the Democratic National Committee. And there are all sorts of reasons as to why people were seeking these files, whether it was one faction of the Democrats or another. But it's like the current situation with President Trump. I don't know any more than anybody here. But what I do know is that when you have special counsels and impeachment proceedings there, that they start off, and it's kind of like an audit from the Internal Revenue Service. If they spend a certain amount of time auditing you, they got to come up with something. And so, and the most common thing is obstruction of justice or lying to the FBI. And I can tell you, as somebody who has contributed to defense funds of many people who were convicted and their convictions overturned, and I'm thinking of people like Charlie Backley, who in the investigation of the Clintons was the only person ever prosecuted, was overturned there, or Lynn Nofziger, who worked for Ronald Reagan later on, is that there isn't anybody in this room who can't be indicted for lying. It's sort of like if somebody says, sir, we're investigating whether you robbed the bank at 8th and Main in San Francisco, and you say, well, I was in Boston that day. But you were in San Francisco, and you got nervous and said that, but you didn't rob the bank. It's a total fabrication, and they indict you for lying. Now, does that make any sense at all? That's the kind of thing that we're dealing with there. So when you look at the context of it, I mean, Nixon made mistakes for which he owned up to, but what is it that justifies impeachment? Did he supposedly misuse the IRS? Well, we've seen what happened under President Obama. Did he have an enemies list? We've seen that kind of list under Obama. Did he misuse the FBI? Not particularly, but we sure have seen that in the last few years there. So I think these things are instructive. When I was talking to Jonathan earlier, he said that a lot of people who come here like to talk about American conservatism in light of what's happening today. And it's no secret that some American conservatives believe that we have some good things being done by an unlikely messenger. And there are many of us who are forthright enough to say that we care more about issues than about personalities. And we really don't care how the chef makes it. We just care about how it tastes at the end of the meal. And from a standpoint of lasting impact, we talked about, let's say, Nixon and China, or Trump and Jerusalem, or whatever. If you're going to appoint a significant number of people to the American judiciary, that's going to last for several decades, especially if they're young enough to survive there. Now, I am of the view that if President Trump only read on the teleprompter, he'd be 10 or 12 points ahead in the polls than he is now. It is beyond my control, and there's at least one excellent speechwriter there, Tony Dolan, who worked for me years ago, and so whenever I see something that's really good, I know it's Tony, and then I go on the internet, and it says, Tony Dolan denied writing this. But, there is unlikeliness to where we are today, but I think those of us who saw the election as a binary choice felt that the alternative of Hillary Clinton would really put the nail in the proverbial coffin of remnants of Americanism, and that this election was at least a holding pattern, buying some time to reverse the sort of wacko, crazy political correctness that we see in our society, where somehow people feel it's a legitimate protest to not even salute the flag or stand for the national anthem. And I would close by making several points. In this book that I've written, I try to draw parallels between the 1960s and today, and what's different and what's the same. And here's what I find. I spoke at campuses in the 60s and sometimes had security, and people were challenging my right to speak. But I can tell you that I had friends who were liberals, not leftists, but liberals, who differed with me, who would defend my right to speak, personally, publicly, there. Some of those kinds of people are still around, like Alan Dershowitz, there, who's older than I, who would have been around. But those kinds of people who felt that there was something in this country called freedom of speech. And you had an American Civil Liberties Union who protected Nazis' right to parade in Skokie, where there were many Holocaust survivors. I understood that. I respected that there. I obviously had contempt for Nazis, but I understood that what free speech is about is if you object to speech, that's not the point there. But even the ACLU has now reverted a half century later to finding certain speech not being protected, and a whole bunch of liberals are now siding with the leftists. So we have one element of the consensus of America that is gone for the time being and has to be restored. The next area is property rights. Now, those have really gone through the tubes, and there was a consensus when I was growing up. There used to be the cliche, a man's house is his castle, which was a metaphor for the idea that you've got your property, you have certain rights there. Now we've taken this degradation of the Interstate Commerce Clause under FDR and gone full swing there, where corporations and businesses are essentially deemed to be instruments of the state. They carry out whatever the will is, whoever's in political power. Now, when I was being schooled in political philosophy, that was called fascism. It was called the corporate state. So that element of consensus is gone. And the third, and maybe the most disturbing, is religion. When I was in elementary school and was taught this kind of trilogy of freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom to property and so on there. We have a situation now where we have this preposterous situation where somebody who bakes a cake or is a florist who, for whatever religious reason, objects to same-sex marriage is to be coerced or forced by the government into officiating. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I were getting married, I wouldn't want to force any vendor to be there who didn't want to be there. I mean, who wants the karma of forcing somebody to bake my wedding cake who hates my guts? And I'm not even saying they hate the guts, because the fact is that the baker and the florist just say, we regularly service people who are homosexuals. They buy flowers here. They buy cookies here. So we just don't want to do a wedding cake. We just don't want to be flowers here. So this is just an example of the lack of consensus we now have and how different it is in the 1960s where I grew up. And that's what I find very, very disturbing. And, those same people who have rhetorically objected to what they call McCarthyism in the 1950s, which has become sort of a short form. Anything that is McCarthyism or McCarthyite is some sort of extreme defamation, name-calling without any basis. And, one of my mentors, William F. Buckley Jr., had written a book called McCarthy and His Critics, and it was summarized in one sentence. He said, what I have found after tremendous study is that those who criticize Joe McCarthy for excesses, which he had, are themselves guilty in their criticism of greater excesses. And so when we look at this situation today of the terrible revelations about sexual predators in the film industry and in politics who are guilty of assault and rape and intimidation, all these terrible things, we find this sort of wave where you look at Al Franken, who I can't stand personally. I don't like his political philosophy. Let me count the ways in which I find him to be a jerk. But, if you asked me, should this guy be thrown out of the Senate because he copped the feel a half dozen times, I would say, he's really a jerk, he's disrespectful, he's discourteous, something should have been done. And I would kind of recall Mildred Younger, who was the wife of Evel Younger, who ran for governor years ago in California. Mildred Younger was president of the student body at USC in the 1950s, and many people thought she would be the first woman governor of California. And I remember very well a long time ago, and when this was starting in the 1970s about sexual harassment, and Mildred Younger must have been 30 years older than I, maybe more. Anyway, she turned to me, she's a very articulate, brilliant woman, and she said, I don't understand this, Arnie. And I said, well, what do you mean, Mildred? She said, well, in my day, when a man got fresh, I just slapped him. And so what we have in this situation here is we really need to hone in on these predators and creeps and who are breaking the law and intimidating women and so on there. But we have a situation where we're at the same old, overkill. And of course, it makes me happy that Franken is going, because there are so many Democrats in the U.S. Senate and the House that are probably very similar, that if that's the standard, we're going to have a wholesale exit. They're certainly in the LA City Council and up in Sacramento, they're going to be going by waves. So, I'm hoping we have this kind of circular firing squad in the Democratic Party. But with that surge of optimism, I will open myself up to questions.
Thank you, Arnold. Arnold has agreed to answer some of your questions. Before he does, I just wanted to say again that Whiplash is available for purchase in the museum store, and he'll be happy to meet every one of you and autograph your book. I'd like to start off by asking the first question. Given the current trajectory of the Trump administration, do you think that the Republican Party and conservatism in general will be successful within the next 4 to 8 years?
I think the jury is out on whether it's going to be successful. I think what we find is a lot of people in the country, and I don't say this in a judgmental way because it doesn't matter whether they're liberals or conservatives or how they profess themselves, are not as philosophical as some of the people in this room. So the fact of the matter is that if the economy is going great and we're not at war, some of those people are going to associate that with their particular person. At the same time, I think all the rules of the past are out the window. So we could face a situation where the economy is going great in a few years, we're not at war, and there still could be a reaction against this particular president's personality. I think that there are a lot of people who no longer understand what conservatism is. The part of conservatism that I grew up with among my famous mentors was that on a personal side, it involved temperament. It was prudence, it was kindness, it was courtesy, it was civility, and all of those things that are not necessarily associated with the current incumbent. So that confuses a lot of people. The second was a limited executive. And again, we have this paradox that we need this strong executive to undo the prior executive power. So I think that there's a great deal of confusion. And to answer your question, I think the answer mainly lies in to what extent we can change the culture. Because I think what I have learned over many decades of intense political involvement, either paid or volunteer or helping out, is at the end of the day, politics is only a holding action. You're only holding your finger in the dike, in the dam there. And so what we have here is a culture, whether you're talking about television or radio or movies or films or plays or production or music and the internet age, the culture is more contagious than it's ever been. And you can go to any small town in America and it seems almost indistinguishable from some big cities because of the universality of the culture. And so I think the answer to the question is, unless we can change the culture, political elections are merely a holding action because the culture is a predictor and shapes political action. And that's where I think a lot of people don't recognize that American conservatism is much more than an election or who's on first or who wins an election. And I think there's no more eloquent statement to that than the fact that this last presidential election is not a transformational election. Absent a few states that Hillary Clinton's $1.5 billion campaign decided to stop tracking polls in and to pull money out and take for granted she would have been elected there. So when you have some technical obstacles, and this is not to take away from the Trump victory, some technical incompetence that is seemingly unpredictable and inexplicable there, absent that there would have been a different winner, you can't say this is a transformational election like FDR in 1932, or by the way, Richard Nixon in 1972, absent Watergate. Richard Nixon made tremendous inroads and Watergate reversed those. So my answer, again, is the culture that needs to change.
We have a question in the front row.
Yeah, Arnie, I wanted to find out, in the sweep of history from the 60s till now, the character of politicians that, in my impression, it seems in the last 10, 20 years, our politicians have become horrifying. Their characters, their values, their treasonous behaviors. Is it a lot different now, or was I just not aware in younger times?
I think the only part of the question with which I agree is the treasonous behavior part. I think that's gone downhill. I mean, I think that we have seen such a difference in what we call American exceptionalism was part of an American consensus. When I grew up as a young boy, George Meany, the head of all of organized labor, was a fiercely patriotic, anti-communist stalwart. That's not the case today. When I grew up in America, immigration was associated with assimilation. That's not the case today. When my mother and father came here in the 1930s, the first thing they wanted to do was learn English, assimilate. My mother went to high school at night, worked in the garment district, to learn about Lincoln and George Washington. We're now in an age where people are discrediting our founding fathers. And so I think that relates to the point you're making about the word that you used is treason. It's what I'm saying sets the stage for that, because when you see America's no different than anybody else, and if you go and you say, I'm really for the women's movement, I'm really for gay rights, but you know, in some of these countries in the Middle East, when they go and beat the crap out of a woman and throw a gay person off of a building or imprison him for 20 years, that's just another culture. And we ought to respect it and understand it. That's preposterous. So you know that they're not really being leveled there. So I think that's all related. On the other hand, I think when it comes to personal conduct and hypocrisy and character, I think that's a constant, because I think that politics like Hollywood draws people who have high egos and who want to be the center of attention, and I think there are defects in the character of many of those people there that's inherent to people seeking the limelight. But I would say that, you know, when you look at, if you go read Thomas Jefferson and you go read Hamilton, it's hard to imagine people nowadays being anywhere up to that level of intellect and introspection. I mean, I go back and read it and say, how could somebody have been this brilliant a couple hundred years ago there? And I read the junk that passes for political rhetoric today, and these politicians are clearly people who haven't read very much at all, and so on. So, but I think that the character defects are just plain more visible in this 24-hour constant news cycle, where when somebody accuses somebody of sexual harassment, by the next day you have 2 more accusers and 3 more accusers, and they're probably all correct there. So it magnifies it. And I think before it's just been sort of hidden and not coming out, because you just don't have this where you could just Google somebody and get it right away.
We have a question in the second row.
It seems that during the 1960s, a lot of the free speech movements were with the more left-wing factions, such as in Berkeley. But it seems that nowadays it's shifted, so in that the free speech is respected less by the left wing and more by the right wing. And whether it is by the Supreme Court, where liberal justices tend to trample over free exercise, whether through Obergefell or through other such rulings. But how can we go back to a bipartisan consensus on free speech, wherein all Americans respect this fundamental right as part of our democracy?
You've got about a half dozen really good questions. Let me take them one at a time. First, the free speech movement, there was 2 components. There was the free speech movement and there was the filthy speech movement. Now, the filthy speech movement was more profanity and sort of, you know, how come my signs can't say this profanity? The free speech movement did have a lot of libertarian support in UC Berkeley, which was, you know, to what extent the campus should regulate speech. And so there was actually, in Berkeley, there was a common ground. There were libertarians, conservatives, and liberals together having legitimate protest against campus regulations. Today, as you have implied there, we have those same or more onerous campus regulations being used to stifle one side. And so you see this litigation now where somebody says, hey, I'm a conservative, I just want to be this, or say, no, you want to get a permit, go 10 days from now and be in this area here where you can do it there. So you're correct in that. But the leftists back then in Berkeley were consistent. They said, we are for free speech, even though we don't like what you say. We should all have free speech at UC Berkeley, and there was that. They don't say that anymore. Now, in the 1960s, there was a leftist philosopher named Herbert Marcuse, who was the father of the intellectual movement to repress free speech from people that may believe like you did. And so when I was on campuses, my opponents who tried to stifle me would cite his writings. And he came up with the doctrine of repressive tolerance. It's a wonderful phrase there. And he was the intellectual precursor of the modern movement that said, noxious, toxic views, as he defined them, are not worthy of the protection of free speech. And so you are correct in that we see today people who are coming up with all sorts of things. I saw one a few days ago, is that if somebody tells you they are a lesbian and you hesitate in an affirmative reaction, then you are a bigot. You know, all sorts of like weird things reconstructing. Did you react a certain way? Did you pause? What words did you use? And so on, as justification for that. And so, how do we get back to it? I think we get back to it by giving more credence to the Alan Dershowitzes of the world, who have a pristine, pure record of consistency who get up there and say, I disagree with X, Y, Z, but I'm going to, you know, it's that old adage about I'm going to fight for your right to free speech. And we have to somehow get back to those ideals. And we're very fortunate because some of the people on the other side are being so ridiculous, so absurd, so extremist, so offensive that they are beginning to alienate some who are peeling off them, who are saying, I can't do this anymore. I understand that this person is bad, but because they are beginning to engage in cannibalism. They are beginning to take some of their own and eat them and say, I don't like what you say. And so that's causing some of the people who are being ostracized to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe I'm with the wrong crowd here. Maybe some of these conservatives aren't so bad there. And I think when you see Ben Shapiro getting millions of listeners there, some of whom are liberal, I think that's a terribly encouraging, sign.
Thank you, Arnold. Please give Arnold Steinberg a round of applause.
Thank you.